Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us today. I do apologise for the short delay. We did start with a slight tech issue, but great to be online and welcoming you all to today's webinar, Country Connections Social Network Analysis for Rural, Regional and Remote Queensland Communities. My name's Jacinta Perry. I am a Partnership Officer at Thriving Queensland Kids Partnership, and I have the honour of leading the Thriving Queensland Kids Country Collaborative Initiative. To kick things off today, I'd just like to acknowledge the various traditional lands that we're all joining from and acknowledge elders past, present and emerging. I'd also just really like to acknowledge that First Nations people have been considering the importance and significance of the way we all connect to each other for eons. It's a really important part of First Nations cultures, and I think gives us a good reminder to always lean into First Nations ways of doing, being and knowing, and consider what that means for our work as well. So today we've got a nice action-packed agenda, and I'm glad that you could all join us to hear from a really fantastic panel of folks. I'd like to acknowledge Matt Healey, who is Principal Consultant at First Person Consulting. You'll have the benefit of hearing all of his wisdom on the topic of SNA throughout today's session. We've also got Dan Smith, Project Manager from the Smith Family Capricorn Communities for Children, who's going to be talking to us in a little bit more detail about what this means at a place-based level. And then I'm also really grateful to be joined by Camilla Davidson, our lead at TQKP for evaluation and research. Camilla will be driving all things tech today, so thank you so much for being here and doing that job for us. Cara Lilly is online from University of Sunshine Coast. She is leading the formal research component of the Social Network Analysis Project. And unable to join us today, but still a very significant part of the project team, is Ben Pook, Government and Advocacy Relations Manager for your town. I'd also just like to acknowledge that the Social Network Analysis Project and the Country Collaborative overall is generously funded by the Tim Fairfax Family Foundation and the John Villiers Trust. So without their generous contributions, this work wouldn't be possible today. So for those of you who have not come across Thriving Queensland Kids Partnership before, we're a systems intermediary. And what that really means at its core is that we bring people together from a whole range of systems and sectors to change the odds for kids to thrive. So we do that by taking an ecological all systems view, which is based on Erases the Nest, Australia's child and youth wellbeing framework, which is one that considers children in the context of their families, their communities, and the broader systems that wrap around them, and also one that helps us meaningfully work with the interconnections across all of the different domains that make up wellbeing across the lifespan. So TQKP's systems work happens as a partnership. We take the P in our name really seriously. We broker, facilitate and affiliate through a whole variety of different partnerships and collaborations. And in practice for Thriving Queensland Kids Partnership Phase 2, that looks like 11 practical and collaborative initiatives that are all in various stages of progression as we speak. So I won't go into all of these in a whole lot of detail, but what I would invite and encourage you to do is to get in touch and reach out if there's something there that does particularly pique your interest. There's lots and lots of things to get involved with at Thriving Kids, but today, of course, we're here to talk about my initiative, the Country Collaborative. The Thriving Kids Country Collaborative is really born out of the realisation that for the 700,000 plus kids who call regions outside Southeast Queensland home, we need to consider how we can best gear our systems to support their development throughout childhood. So we have a group of 30 plus organisations across rural, regional, remote Queensland communities, across a very wide range of sectors, representing NGOs, government departments, philanthropies, peak bodies, PHNs, universities, lots of different people who are in our mix, who are all focused on what it means for kids to thrive, regardless of postcode, in rural, regional and remote communities. And working in such a broad, diverse area, my initial thinking when I stepped into the role was, gosh, how are we going to do justice to this amazingly diverse range of people who we have around the table and all of the places that they represent? And what we came upon really quickly is that people tend to be united in some of their sore points and also some of the areas that they identify as being really ripe with opportunities. So the work of the Country Collaborative has primarily been around issues of workforce investment, getting equitable outcomes for children and young people in country communities. This is all really underpinned by this idea of country voices. So really, who's speaking with who, who's partnering with who's advocating for who's making the most impact out there, and are our voices really reaching the ears that we kind of need them to reach? So we know that things work a bit differently in the bush, and things work differently in smaller towns and regions. And so we asked our collaborators, what's so important about this Country Voices piece? What really drives this and makes it significant within country communities? And what they told us is that partnerships are really central to all of the work we do. At the end of the day, if it's at a grassroots level, in an early years centre through to a strategic level partnership happening at a statewide level, it's people who deliver these interventions for kids. It's people who actually progress this work and have the opportunity to create the change that we want to see. So the centrality of partnerships is really, really clear. The other thing we know and that we heard is that partnerships are very powerful. They really form a huge aspect of the intangible social capital that communities have and that organisations have, that people have, and that they're really deeply intertwined with creating the positive impacts in communities that we like to see. On the flip side, this also means they're highly sensitive to things like workforce policy and investment shifts that see them disrupted. A program that's defunded can have broader impacts at a place-based level as we see, the churn and maybe the reshuffle of local partners and stakeholders who are in an area. So we know that makes a difference. According to the Country Collaborative, place also really matters. Partnerships are different in country communities where localised service systems have to essentially do more with less a lot of the time and work very cohesively and in a decentralised way. And finally, we know something else that's significant about partnerships in rural, regional and remote Queensland communities is that distance matters. The decentralised population of Queensland can make ties to geographically distant communities a little bit looser, and sometimes that can leave decision makers with less information about the particular strengths and needs and assets within those regions, and also less opportunity to build the deep partnerships and connections that we know are really supportive of sustained and positive change. So our question then became, if partnerships are so valuable to us, then how do we go about measuring them? They always seem to be so intangible. And luckily, there's a brilliant technique to do just that. And this is where social network analysis comes in. Now, I'm not going to steal Matt's thunder. Trust me, he'll tell this story better than I. But for the purposes of some basic context, social network analysis is a technique that can be used to understand and measure relationships within a network. Okay, so think who's who wields the influence, who connects us all together. And significantly for the Country Collaborative, what our group was particularly keen on understanding is, so what does this mean for how we might strengthen our collective advocacy approach and way of working together in rural, regional, remote Queensland? And also, what are some of the leverage points where we might actually be able to advocate for change? So it was off the basis of this that the Social Network Analysis Project, or the SNAP as we fondly refer to it, was born. So we decided to bring together a small working group of people within the Country Collaborative, along with Matt Healey from First Person Consulting, to map the organisational network that exists to support child health and wellbeing across country Queensland. So what this actually looks like in process is a survey. And that survey we decided to design around a race is the nest, because as I flagged earlier, the nest provides us with an incredibly robust systems map that helps us to traverse all of the different touch points and areas that touch a child's life, and that of their family, communities and broader systems as well. So when it comes to actually delivering the survey, we're really looking for a pretty broad range of people, because it's really quite a broad question. But ultimately, we're hoping to have responses from people in organisations that have a service footprint in country Queensland, organisations that are actually based in rural, regional, remote areas, those folks who have research ties to country Queensland communities, in government, or who have political or advocacy ties to areas, and also organisations who fund child, family and youth initiatives in rural, regional, remote Queensland. So you can see it's quite a diverse range of folks who are hoping to undertake the social network analysis when it is released. But yeah, I'm hoping that all of you can see yourself or see people that you know from your networks represented in that list. So in addition to undertaking the SNA, we wanted to do a little bit more. We were really conscious that it can be easy to do these types of projects and sort of end up with a really great map at the end, but then so what, right? What does that mean for our understanding? And also, what do we do when it's out of date in a pretty short period of time, which we know tends to be a risk with these types of approaches? So to mitigate that, we decided that we would form a learning partnership. And what that means is that the Social Network Analysis Project is not just about the SNA, but rather it's about a few broader pieces that we want to bring into the fold, that we hope is going to make the project more impactful in the country Queensland ecosystem, but importantly is also going to impart some knowledge and some capability to other people in country Queensland, so that you can all consider the relevance of applying this work within your own communities and contexts. So I'm excited to let you know that we have received ethics approval to run a research project, so a formal research project component of the SNAP. That's really going to be about trying to understand what this capacity building piece was like, and evaluate how effective and meaningful it was for folks out in country Queensland. We're also working together as a group to develop an SNA advocacy tool. So think of this as a, how do I do an SNA, but also what does it mean? What do I do maybe with an SNA if I've actually done one? And finally, this webinar today is a great opportunity for us to all talk to you about what we've learned so far about SNA, and for you to have the benefit of Matt's amazing knowledge on the topic, and hopefully start to build your understanding of it as well. So by bringing all of those pieces together, our hope is that we can start to strengthen our collective approach towards partnerships in country Queensland via a greater collective understanding. So if you're feeling inspired, if you're feeling interested, here's how you can get involved in next steps. So I'd like to invite all of you to complete the SNA survey. Now you will receive a link to this after the webinar. And after you get it, I'd like to encourage you to tell your friends, and tell them to tell their friends and their friends and their friends, and so on. The more data, the more people, the richer a picture we're able to create here is really going to make a huge difference in the quality of the outcome that we're able to have here. And I'd also just like to invite you again to get in touch with me if you'd like to hear more about the broader work of the Country Collaborative, or about Thriving Queensland Kids Partnership overall. I think Camilla's going to pop some details in the chat there. A standing open invitation to all of you. We're always interested in hearing from new collaborators and partners across the network. So speaking of collaborators and partners across the network, it's now my pleasure to hand over to Dan Smith, Project Manager from the Smith Family Capricorn. Dan will tell you more about his work, but we wanted to hear particularly from him because he gives us a really, really good lens on what this really means at a place-based level. So over to you, Dan. Thank you.
If the wonders of technology are working, are you hearing me okay, Jacinta? Thumbs up, wonderful, wonderful. So that's one success there in networking at the moment. I've been an active contributor to the Country Collaborative since it's kicked off. I can't help myself but go to a meeting and do more than have a cup of coffee and a bicky. So even in terms of that, that's sort of part of the storytelling we're looking at. But part of what I was keen to look at and unpack when this action group were getting together with the social networking analysis project was really better understand how the theory and the fancy software that Matt plays with help support the practice wisdom of what we do and how we play. I'm going to tell a little bit of a Smith family tale and lead into some other tales. Like I like telling stories and drawing analogies, and bear with me, those who know me tell me there's probably going to be a bad dad joke or two along the way as well. You can see my mugshot in the middle there, and you can see there's either stars or flowers on top of my forehead. That was actually a candid snap taken at a Gracemere Community Fair, which was something we brought together as a response to build capacity in the needs of our community in the local area. I paused that as a bit of a candid thing back at myself because we do serious work, but sometimes along the way while we're doing serious work, we need to make sure we stop and have some fun along the way as well. So that's just part of that authenticity I think is important in working in place where you are. You need to sort of find the feel and the vibe of where you are. Communities for Children, you can see there in the words there that the initiative commenced back in 2005. It's all about encouraging healthy community environments for disadvantaged children. 52 sites around the nation. Smith family is really fortunate with 9 sites. When I talk to my colleagues in the other 9 sites, we all have very different places and spaces we play in. In Rockhampton, I've got 2 of the local regional councils in my footprint. Colleague in Townsville has a Townsville West, which is basically 6 schools. If I compare that 6 schools, I've got about 32 schools to play with, so different needs in place. Colleague in Northern Territory, operating in Katherine, I think they've got a third of the Northern Territory under their footprint, so very different spaces and places in terms of how to bring things together. The words sort of say itself there, like in terms of the work we're doing, it's sort of trying to facilitate partnerships. We don't get involved in the direct service delivery. It's about funding things for others, responding to priority needs and responding to those needs in community. Okay, now what makes it work? All sorts of things make it work, and in different spaces and places, it's a whole spectrum or a continuum of the formal things you do in terms of formal partnership principles and all of those things that are in contracts and all sorts of other things in that regard. But for me, what really greases the cogs of partnerships are the informal things you do, the intentional work in terms of having that cup of coffee in the bicky, that getting authentic, getting known to people, finding out if somebody's needing some help, how to connect them with somebody else to bring things closer together. Just in some project review discussions I've had this week, we've collaborated with some partners there who had some challenges in terms of where to hold their service delivery in a space, and we could connect and network with them to another community hall or another emerging community hub. So for me, it's that fabric there of intentionally going beyond the formal things you do and actually bringing it to the authentic conversations that sort of communities thrive on as well. I could talk about that for a lot further, but it's really about the essence and the vibe. Think about the castle. It's about the vibe. It's about the feel of the thing. If we look at social networking analysis, we know the methodology might take us a step closer. So for me, it's the feel and the vibe of what I know happens and works well in our space and place, but there is actually some theory and some practice behind that as well. You think about your own communities. We've all got small, well-connected sort of nodes of individuals who are key people in different networks. And think about that as the playgroups. Think about that with the schools, the footy clubs. They've all got their connections of make things happen. I reflected for a moment there in terms of my upbringing in Elliot Heads outside of Bundaberg and my own father. And he had the news agency, he had the general kiosk, he had the post office sub-agency, he was in the fire brigade for the Rural Fire Brigade, he was with the Lifesaving Club. So for me, he was a person that sort of was connected to many other connections of what's going on. And if I reflect back to larger things, those small connections he had sort of flowed into larger connections across regions and across states and things like that. We've got a picture there of a lovely playgroup, and you think about the people that turn up to that playgroup, they might be working in all sorts of different jobs in their communities, they're in all sorts of different hats. But when they're at the playgroup, you know, they're mums and dads and their caregivers. But in a social network, who knows who you know in your social network? Think about the Sesame Street song in terms of who are the people in your neighbourhood. Now, I'm not going to sort of sing the whole song for you, but maybe it's an earworm that'll get stuck in your own head. But it's the people that you meet each day, like it's the butcher, the baker. I'm not going to say the candlestick maker, but I couldn't help myself. It kept on coming out. They're the people in the different roles who are the fabric of community, the sticky glue, the ones you need to get to know. Now, if you happen to go to a community, it's how do you get to know those people? If we had a service mapping exercise, as Jacinta said earlier on, by the time you're done that exercise, it might already be out of date. So it's really, when you come into a new community, I know my approach is generally to ask who are the 2 or 3 people I need to get to know who might help me know other people. The brackets I had there, or not as regularly, but are always there should you need them. And a perfect example, I had that recently myself, was I'd actually had a person come and look to join a particular club, and they'd indicated to me in conversation they had interest in research. Now, I just happened to have another passion project in community where I was the chair of the hospital foundation, and I just happened to have known a few directors who had research interest in health. So I just made a connection and connected this lady to a gentleman, and I just left it at that. 2 weeks later, I've heard back that they've actually connected, had a cup of coffee, had a yarn, and now the person who was looking to get into research has actually got a full-time employment job coming through. So sometimes it's about those little things that you need to connect people and bring people together through networks that helps things come along. So beyond the who are the people in your neighbourhood, some of you may have heard of Malcolm Gladwell. About a decade ago, he wrote a book called A Tipping Point, and that was all about looking at the tipping points in social epidemics. How do you bring movements and how do you foster change and facilitate change? And in that, he identified sort of 3 different types of people. He identified mavens, he identified connectors and salespeople. Now, I'm not going to sort of say they're the only labels that these people may have, because in community we need all sorts of different labels, and in communities we might wear lots of different hats at different points in time. Humbly, I'd suggest that I'm probably a connector in many ways, because I get to know lots of people and I have many social connections and I can tend to make friends easily, but I'm able to reach out and find somebody who might know somebody who can help somebody else. But if I don't know some of those people who know everything, and also the people who know how to write funding agreements or navigate other issues or talk about how to take a problem into a solution, really that's where the magic happens in terms of social networking. From my perspective, if I'm not looking at it from an academic thing, is getting all of the right types of people together to actually come together and share toys in their sandpit. So really, if we're looking for a better understanding of the types of people we can connect with, it's really going to help us thrive and make a difference in the communities that we're working with. In further storytelling, like if we can pause for a moment, and hopefully you've started to think about what are your social networks in your own community. For me, I couldn't help but reflect back to a country practice home and away in Blue Healers, and in some respects I'm probably showing my age, because they were, they're quite aged programs now. Some of you, I hope, would remember the Bob Hatfields and the Frank Gilroys and the Shirleys, from a country practice. Think about Wandon Valley. It's a little microcosm of a bit of a study there. All sorts of things happen in Wandon Valley. But if you think back to the very, very beginning of Wandon Valley, there used to be Beverly who ran the telephone exchange. Now, if you ever want a better example of somebody who knew everybody, it was Beverly, the telephone exchange person. If we go to home and away and we look at Pippa and Tom Fletcher, who had the caravan park and they had a whole heap of foster kids. What another great way of sort of connecting and sort of helping people in community and helping children. You look at home and away as well, and you take a step back for a moment. There was Donald Fisher way back in the beginning, and he was the principal, and he sort of knew all sorts of different things in another way. but you can't leave home and O without reflecting upon Alf Stewart. I'm sure every community that we speak has got an Alf Stewart or two, but I'm sure every community or two has probably got a Marilyn, or they've got an Esme Watson, the people who know everything and talk about everything and share it along as well. Blue Healers, same, but different. You've got Senior Sergeant Tom Croydon. How many issues happened in Mount Thomas? But it's not about the issues, it's about the connections and the social connections and really what happened there. So for me, it's the storytelling through those television communities and how we might be able to apply that thinking to our own communities and sort of paint some pictures and sort of see the merits in what we're doing. Take a step back for a moment and just think about in your own little social network, whether it's your personal network, whether it's your business network for your current role, or whether it's your network over all of the roles you've had in your career. How do these things add up? Like, who are the people in your neighbourhood? I think you'll find more people are there than you think you know. I'm coming to you from Rockhampton at the moment. It's really important to think about the place that we work in, really what surrounds us shapes us. There's a lovely picture there of Queensland, and I can't remember where I harvested that picture on, but as I was looking at preparing this presentation, I realised that they've actually spelled Bundaberg with a U. So as a past Bundaberg resident, I could be affronted at that, but for me, it's part of the conversation point. We can help connect other people through mistakes people make as well. As we go into my footprint there, you can sort of see the Rockhampton regional councils and Livingston Shire councils. That's sort of part of my footprint for one role. But it also doesn't sort of take into account my connections across country Queensland through the Country Collaborative, or my connections across Australia through the Smith family and other things. So think about your networks in a different way. I'd like to sort of plant that seed or make that request to you all, that in documenting my social network, it might help me in my work to advocate or influence policies where I live, where I play, where I've chosen to put my roots down and raise a family. Maybe you can help me to help you and other people by participating in this social network analysis project where and when you can. I don't want to steal Matt's thunder, but he's got lots of great nuggets of gold to share. And thank you for giving me your time and your ears for a little while. Thanks a lot. Over to you, Matt.
Thank you. So just to also double check, you can hear me fine? Yes, okay, good. We're on a roll. Thanks, Dan. So my name's Matt Healey, and I'm here today to talk to you about social network analysis and specifically what we're trying to do through this project. So I am going to sort of introduce some of the concepts that both Jacinta and Dan have alluded to in a bit more detail. So hopefully you'll get something out of this, even if you are familiar with some of the ideas behind SNA. Just a bit about us first. So I work at an organization called First Person Consulting. We've been around for about 10 years now, and by and large, we do program evaluation and those sorts of things. We do a lot of systems-based work too, and a smattering of other sort of design-based processes as well. Lots of different topic areas, lots of different clients. I don't want to say we're a pretty standard sort of consulting firm, but we do lots of stuff with lots of people. And I think one thing that we really enjoy doing, and one of the reasons why I'm excited by this project, is like this is kind of an interesting kind of question. It's not like a typical sort of project. And I think that's why I'm particularly interested in exploring this with the team. So I myself, there I am, you can see me in this little network of my colleagues. I work across lots of our areas of practice, but the systems-based work, so network analysis being one of them, is kind of a key area of mine, which is why I'm here today. So to kick things off, up to this point, people might have been hearing the phrase social network analysis and thinking, I don't actually know what that is. That's why I'm here. I will give you a bit of a primer. Probably the simplest way to start with. Social network analysis is essentially a way of understanding systems. So it's a particular technique that's used to map relationships. In the sort of more like heavy theory of SNA, it's talked about as like mapping networks, but really think of it as a way of understanding systems. A system itself is, this set of dots like you see on the right-hand side of this page. They're all connected they fulfill some form of function through those connections. No system exists just because. Like, every system is a system because it's fulfilling some form of purpose. Whether that purpose is positive or negative kind of doesn't matter. There isn't a set of relationships that exists without something manifesting or resulting from that. So we're using SNA to try to understand these relationships. And really what SNA is helping us understand is the nature of that relationship. So when something is a system or within a system, some of the terms that we use are things like the relationships are a reflection of interdependence. So that relationship means that you're reliant on each other, whether it's in a one-way or two-way connection. Kind of think of it like, a pipe with fuel flowing between it. Like, there is some form of interaction that's occurring. Within a network, there are changes that happen, and as a result of those changes, adaptations are made. So again, you can kind of apply this to almost any set of interactions or any context, and you can potentially start to sort of conceptualize what we mean there. And as I said, these systems are interacting to produce, we say outcomes, but changes or results. But there is something that is produced as a result of these interactions. Sometimes those changes or those sort of results can be predictable, in a fairly kind of linear fashion. But sometimes when you kind of combine lots of them together, we use this phrase called emergence or emergent outcomes, which is essentially that these ideas that the changes or the results can be disproportionate to the interactions themselves. So you might have heard that phrase, greater than the sum of their parts and that sort of thing. That's what we're alluding to here, where essentially you've got a multitude of interactions that the result produced is not necessarily because of each of those interactions 1 + 1 + 1, but it's actually the sum of them together and what that means. So network analysis is a technique that we can use to understand the kind of abstract concepts that I've just described there. That sort of conceptualization is very challenging when you try to sort of do it within your, within your mind's eye. And so that's why these sorts of techniques are really important, because essentially what it's helping us do is make sense of complexity. So SNA is one technique, there are others, and that's something that's important to remember. So the sort of phrase that I would typically use when I talk about SNA is that it's one of many sorts of systems practices. So systems practice is like applied systems thinking. So there are many ways to think about systems. There are many ways to understand or model complex systems. SNA is one of them. I think SNA is a particularly beneficial process for people who are trying to make sense of complex systems because it's quite a structured, guided process. There are kind of, like I said, a various number of forms of ways that you can conceptualize systems, but SNA is quite structured for reasons that will become clearer in a moment. But the great thing about SNA is that it is quite clear on some of the products that come out of it, which are the visuals of the systems themselves. The sort of phrase social network analysis is also quite intentional. And when we say social network, we're not referring to like Facebook or something like that. So what we're actually referring to are sort of three concepts or three ideas. So the first being social. So the social element in social network analysis is basically referring to the fact that there are, it says actors, but you can think of it as concepts or things that they are operating. So they are moving. So think of it in that way. They are socializing. That socializing occurs within a networked fashion. So they are connected and there's a reason for that connection being drawn. So that line between the dots that you see on the right-hand side, there is a reason for that. It's not just an arbitrary thing. And then the analysis form, basically depending on the level of complexity of the network can vary, but there are particular techniques that we can use to make sense of the network. So it's essentially a representation of a structure. So this image on the right-hand side here has 8 different agents or actors. There are a set of relationships drawn between them, so they are networked. And we could apply social network analysis if we really wanted to this set of 8 agents, or you could just look at it and interpret it by eye. So I could look at this and I could say, number 1 is potentially a bit isolated because they are only connected to number 2, but number 8 is quite central because they are connected to number 7, number 6, number 3, and number 2. There are those sorts of things. And at this level, the sort of visual is almost enough. But if there was, 100 different dots and 1,000 different relationships drawn between them, you kind of lose the ability to interpret it by eye or in a bird's eye view, and you kind of need the platforms that allow you to do the more in-depth analysis. It is an abstract technique. So the reason I would call it abstract is because as a part of its application to something, you kind of have to define what it is that you're looking at. So while it says, actors or agents, you could also apply it to like concepts or factors or things that aren't people. In most examples that you'll see in like literature and those sorts of things, though, it'll be used in like, say, like organizational change or partnerships or those sorts of things. So that is the more common application, but not necessarily the only way in which it can be used. So as an example, for instance, this is a network map that I did for a particular project for a client. So it's for a grant program. Funder is the purple dot in the center. The funded projects are the yellow ones, and their partners are the blue ones. And there's the relationships drawn between them. This would be a fairly standard approach. But you could also apply it to, for instance, to recipes. So this is a network analysis of recipes. So it's not so much that the people are interacting in this context, because there are no people. It's about the co-occurrence of ingredients with each other in a particular recipe. And what you can potentially see at a very surface level is that there's quite a sort of almost gravitational pull between sweet and savory ingredients on the left and right-hand sides. But sort of down the middle are almost the ingredients that occur in both. And so this is where network analysis can be really beneficial, because network analysis would allow you to identify which ingredient out of all ingredients in this set of recipes is the most important. Like that's the kind of question that you could answer in this level. I'm only showing you this not because I'm suggesting that you all apply this to recipes, but just to give you a sense of what it can be applied to, which is anything that is in a network or is connected or, as I said at the start, is related to each other in some form. So if you want to sort of cut through definition or description of what SNA is, SNA or social network analysis is a way of capturing, visualizing and analyzing actors, agents, things, and their relationships as a system. So again, this example on the right-hand side here is another one that I've produced in a different context. There's something like 1,000 different elements and about 1,200 different connections. So very big, very complex. And if I said to you, which one is the most central or which one has the most connections, you wouldn't be able to tell me that, just by looking at it. You would have to delve into it a bit more deeply. And this is the level of complexity that we kind of understand when we think about things like sectors or, at a statewide level, these big networks of things. But also when you start to think about like cross-sector collaborations or cross-sector partnerships and things like that, where it's a bit murkier as to who's connected to who or who's working with each other. And so this is where network analysis is really useful, because it's providing these point-in-time opportunities to understand what is happening. And then as a result of that, what might we do next? So that leads me to this next point that I want to focus on around the kind of role and value of network analysis. So, you can maybe start to see where some of those sort of contributions that SNA could play in your own area or practice are. But I think if I really had to sort of sell this to someone at a very high level, there's kind of 3 reasons for doing this. And I think we have to be very clear on this, that SNA, like it's not a quick and dirty kind of task. It is, effectively a whole research method. So like all research methods, we need to be clear on the purpose. You wouldn't just do this because you're wanting to answer particular types of questions or have a reason for doing it. So for me, there would be 3 reasons why you would apply this to a sort of particular context. The first one is it's a clarifying process. So SNA as an approach does require you to define a whole bunch of concepts, and you do that through asking questions. You have to reflect on who's involved, the nature of the connections in the network. It does force you to prioritize. So when you start to get into the planning for data collection stage, there's no space for nice to have questions. You can't just say, oh, wouldn't it be nice to know if type stuff, because every question that we're asking about relationships is applied to every relationship. And so, if we say, okay, well, we want to collect, the top 100 organizational partners for everyone in our network, that means that every question is applied to every one of those relationships. So if you ask one question, that means you're asking 100 questions. So just to give you a sense of what you have to be thinking about here, we're not asking questions about an organization as such. We are asking organizations to comment on their networks. So it's a different type of level of thinking. And so we have to be really clear on the importance of what we're asking by being almost clear on, well, why are we even doing this process? And like we kind of alluded to here, for us within this project, it's about exploration and understanding, but also proof of concept and demonstration of the benefits of having this bigger picture view of what the network or the system looks like in country Queensland. The clarification piece is also really beneficial because it does kind of force you to think about, well, when we say partner, what do we mean? Like, what is a partner to us, and what that might be to you, or how, Camilla interprets that could be quite different to how someone else interprets that. So you have to go through these kinds of processes to be quite clear on what you mean before you get to the later steps. You do get visual outputs, and those visuals aren't just pretty pictures. I mean, they are pretty pictures, as you saw from some of those that I shared before, but they are also useful in catalyzing discussions or engagement with people. People will say, oh, we have lots of partners, or here's a visual of what that looks like, or, this feels like a very complex context to be operating within, or this is what that complexity looks like. It also provides you with an externalized view, or like a pictured view of what people perceive when they talk about, a complex network of organizations or things like that. It can also help you challenge assumptions within that too. So you might have you yourself or someone within your team or context might have assumptions about who is the most influential or who should be, an organization that's engaged for a particular reason. This could potentially challenge that or could confirm it. So again, this is why these processes can be beneficial, because it can kind of almost challenge things that we take as a given, which is sometimes quite important. The third reason is that ultimately it does, as a research process or as an exploratory process, it does produce insights around what you don't know, or it could act as evidence for what you already do know or what you feel you know. So it's a good way to think about it in terms of demonstrating outcomes. The other benefits of this are that it can support integration of different forms of knowledge. So it is and we'll touch on this in a second, it is a quantitatively based technique. And a lot of partnership-based work is explored qualitatively in some forums. So this is actually a nice complement to that in that it doesn't replace those forms of knowledge or knowing, but it can complement them by providing you with either a basis for prioritizing conversations with certain organizations over others, but it can also be a way for almost demonstrating and appealing to certain participants or organizations or parties that have a preference for certain forms of knowledge over others as well. And where you have those opportunities to look at some of these things over time, it also can show you how things are changing, which is sometimes, again, quite beneficial. Some of these points under number 3 kind of tie into like, well, why are we even doing this process? So some of these things you wouldn't expect to be kind of an unexpected surprise necessarily. You would kind of go into the process knowing that you wanted to produce a network map for a particular reason. But I guess to highlight the value of it, and if I go back one step, like these sorts of visuals here are very powerful outputs. And as a communication tool, like pictures tell 1,000 words. Well, here's what 1,000 organizations and 1,200 relationships looks like. Like that's quite powerful, just, as a sort of immediate image to show people as well. So as I mentioned, it is based on maths, and if this is your reaction when you hear that idea, then that's okay. You don't need to sort of know the inner workings of the technique too much. Really, what we're trying to be clear on is that the networks or the systems that are presented are created from 2 sets of information that you need to collect. They are the dots or the elements, is what I would refer to them as, depending on the context within which you're reading about this. You might see them called nodes or vertices, but the dots on the map, the elements, the organizations. And then the other one is the lines drawn between them. So I would refer to them as connections. You'll sometimes see them referred to as edges or ties, depending on context. But basically, you're collecting information against these two components. So you're trying to collect, for instance, a list of all of the different dots or organizations that are in a particular setting or context, and you're trying to draw lines between each of them. That's the broad goal of what you're trying to do through SNA. The definitional work that I mentioned before, that guided clarifying process that you have to go through, this is where that starts to come in, because you have to start to think about, well, when we think about the organizations, if I think about it at that level, what limits to organizations do we include? How do we define what an organization is? If it's an unincorporated community group, like, do we include them? If it's a government department that has multiple teams and divisions within it, like, do we call it the department, or do we think about it at the teams level? What is the most rational or logical way to think about that network? When we think about the relationships between them, do we think about it in terms of, say, formal connections? So, list all of the organizations that you have an MOU with is a very different type of question to tell me all of the organizations that you work with or interact with on a weekly basis. Those are two very different types of sets of connections that you might be asking people for, or that you are conceptualizing your relationships around. Do you think of it in terms of who you work with as opposed to partners? For you, they could be synonymous, but for someone else, they could be completely different things. The key thing, though, and the reason why I come back to this idea that it's a quantitatively based technique, is that you are collecting discrete information. So you can technically collect free text information, but it's not really used in the analysis. It's more like background information. So everything boils down to like categorizations or numerical values or these sorts of things, because that's what you need in order to produce the analysis, because the analysis is based on a particular branch of mathematics. So the connections, for instance, they are binary. There is a line or there isn't. There's no in between. And that's why that definitional process, that clarifying process that you have to go through is really important. Because if Dan says to me, oh, I've got 5 partners, and I say, okay, great, thanks, Dan, that's really good. And then Camilla says, I've got 50, and I take both of those at face value without questioning them, or like we're not clear on what that relationship actually means. It could later turn out that Dan's listed, 5 government departments and Camilla's listed 50 individuals. So like being really clear on the levels that we're talking about and the formality of those things are really important steps, because at the end of the day, we're asking for very specific pieces of information. And so when we talk about connections, we're basically saying, are we going to draw a line between these 2 dots or do we not? Now you can do overlays, because I know that's the first question people then ask, like, how do we do strength and how do we do this and how do we do that? You can add on all of those things. But think of it like, first we have to join the 2 dots with a pipe or whatever, and then we can, color it in, we can put things over the top of it, we can cover it up, whatever analogy you want to use. The connection has to be there first before you can do the extra bits of information over the top. So I always describe them as like overlays, because at the end of the day, that line has to be there first before you get any of that nice to have information. So graph theory, if you really want to get into the maths behind it, is the foundation that's used to visualize and analyze the network. As I said, if you don't have a head for maths, don't stress. You don't actually need to know like the formula that are used to undertake the analyses and things like that. The key thing that you need to remember, though, is that it's a quantitatively based technique, which means that everything is either categorized or numerical in nature. And then that's the form of the information that you need to be able to walk away with when you then get ready to prepare your visualizations. So even if you collect, free text information by saying, describe your organization for us, like what type of organization you are, you would still have to go through and thematically analyze the responses into categories in order to then use that in your visualization process. So just to reinforce, that's the way in which we're understanding the nature of the information that's required. Okay, so as I said before, you can use this for, recipes, but partnerships is probably the most common context within which I use social network analysis. So it is very much a way of understanding partnerships. So when I say partnerships, I've kind of reinforced this point, hopefully to the nth degree. Partnerships can be interpreted in many ways. Formal partnerships, collaborators, whatever. It doesn't matter. The thing that we're trying to reflect here is that it's a way of visualizing the lines drawn between dots, whether the dots are people in a community or organizations collaborating across Australia. It doesn't matter. It is dots and the lines that connect them. So you can really apply this at any level. Like I've done this, for instance, in a disaster recovery context in a small township in Victoria, looking at like people, like individuals in a recovery project. And I've also applied this, at bigger levels, statewide collaborations, information sharing networks, and those sorts of things. The key criteria to make it worthwhile is that you have a question that needs to be answered either through a visual, so having the picture that shows you what it looks like, and that's its intended purpose, so that visual outputs level, or you've got something that's quite complex, and those deeper questions of who is the most central doesn't have an answer that you can kind of interpret by eye or just through conversation. So there has to be a sufficient level of complexity within that network, or as is the context for the SNAP project, there has to be a sufficient level of complexity or uncertainty over what is out there, what is happening. So that exploratory sense of things. So as an example, in this map to the right here, and you'll see from my little recording, which thankfully works, there's actually 302 different organizations and nearly 460 relationships between them. And through the particular platform that I like to use, and which we're using in this project called Kumu, like you can not only develop the visual, but you can actually interact with it too. So we can do these little like hover over things, and we can kind of zoom in, and I've hidden the labels of the organizations, but you can like hover over the maps and you can kind of filter it and those sorts of things. So this is where that understanding of the complexity that comes into the process is really beneficial, because we can ask additional questions. We don't have to know all of the questions in advance. We can explore the data once we've got it. So for me, this is where SNA applied to something in this context is really both the process and the output. So like you get the clarifying stuff, you get the visual, but then not only that, it can then feed into further processes around project planning, project delivery, or evaluation as well. So just to give you a sense of the sorts of questions that you might ask across those three stages, at a really basic level, you might say, okay, well, I'm this sort of organization and we're, thinking about doing a climate justice project. I'm saying that because that's a particular project that we've actually just done here in Victoria. And some of the questions that we asked through that was, okay, well, we're looking across a particular LGA, looking at the intersection between climate change and justice outcomes. Who is the most central organisation? Because we've got the justice system or the justice sector, so community legal services and those sorts of things, but also climate change focused organisations like environmental teams in local government, emergency management organisations, those sorts of things. Like, who is the most central in those networks? Because some of the organisations do talk to each other for other reasons. So, what is the current state of play? I don't want to call it a baseline, but that sort of idea. Who is, that key person or key organization that could maybe act as a bit of a hub in the early stages of our project that we want to develop? Who is isolated or disconnected? So are there organizations that are on the periphery that don't have very many connections, that, it takes a long time for them to get information, for instance? Who do we want to try and strengthen or build connections with? And I think a really important one, and this comes up in the example that I'll share in a little bit, who could we draw upon to actually support the aims of the project? And are they the people that we think should be involved? Or are we actually just making assumptions and involving the same people we always involve? That particular question will become more apparent when I get to my example shortly. In the delivery context, you might look at things like in a sort of, more operationalization way and say, okay, well, we've got these connections between partners that we thought were going to be used. Are people actually using them? Like, are they actually being incorporated into how people are sharing information, for instance? We can use network analysis to look for bottlenecks or risks in the network. So, for instance, Dan won't mind if I use it as an example, but we'll say, for instance, like, oh, Dan Smith from the Smith family, he's actually like a key bridge between this group of organizations and that group of organizations. If he leaves, or if the Smith family stops operating in this part of Queensland, like, conceivably, those two groups will no longer have any sort of way for information to get between them that we're aware of. That's a risk. And so then we can do something about that, for instance. The other way that you could look at it, and Dan, I'm going to pick on you again, is we could say, oh, like these two groups, like information doesn't really get between them, but Dan does connect them. It might become apparent that actually Dan is actually gatekeeping and he's like not sharing information or allowing information to flow between them. So it's not always a risk in that sense that he's potentially going to get a new job and go somewhere else. He could also be inhibiting the exchange of information as well. So that can happen. And in an evaluative context, you might look at things like how's the network changing over time? So how are new organizations being added to it? Who are they connected with? Have the strength of connections changed? Are there particular elements? It says elements, it's a bit depersonalizing, but are there organizations or groups that were particularly valuable? What you're probably noticing here is that there's a bit of a value judgment that comes in with some of these questions. And that's because I wouldn't necessarily expect for S&A to just answer these questions sometimes by themselves. There will be either a process of interpretation or potentially additional data collection that you need to do. S&A is just one method. It's not like a silver bullet. It answers all of the questions. So in an evaluation where I use S&A, it will be just one method amongst interviews and other forms of data collection and analysis and interpretation that we use. So that's also really important to remember. So just thinking about the sorts of things that S&A itself can tell you. So these are the things that, just from knowing who the elements are and who the dots are and who the lines are between them. There are kind of 4 key things that it can actually tell us. So you don't need any other information than just the dots and the lines. From that, we can tell you, for instance, things like the number of relationships that each individual organization has, and also the directionality of those connections. So are they two-way, one-way? So connections coming in versus going out. That can be really useful, for instance, in identifying organizations that are seen as very influential. So, if the Smith family has a very high in degree, that would suggest that lots of organizations have indicated that they work with the Smith family. So I would look at that and say, oh, okay, so the Smith family seems to be very highly regarded around this topic area or this thing that we're exploring. That's quite a basic metric. We start to get into more of the heavy maths side of things. When we look at things like closeness. So closeness is exactly what it sounds like. It's how close one element is to every other element in a network. So if I refer you back to that example with the sort of 1,000 organizations in the network, I can apply social network analysis and look specifically at the closeness measure. And I could tell you out of that 1,000 organizations, which organization is the closest to the other 999. And when I say closest, I mean essentially degrees of separation. So how many lines would you have to cross through to get from organization A to organization B to organization C and so on and so on. Closeness measures are really useful when you think about communications. So if I want to get a message out really quickly, I would go to the organizations that have the highest closeness scores in a network, because based on the data that we've got, they would be able to distribute that message the fastest to everyone in our network. The betweenness measures, this is where we start to get into things like sort of risk. So this is that bridging idea. So when I mentioned before that Dan is kind of bridging different groups, betweenness is what tells us that. So it's essentially telling us how often a particular organization sits between 2 other organizations. So it's like a bridge. And that bridge, though, can be helpful in the sense that it facilitates information flows, but it can also be a hindrance. It can prevent the flow of information if an organization gatekeeps, for instance. And the last one, which is a very fancy sounding phrase and is quite fun to say, is eigenvector. And so the eigenvector metric, the simplest way to understand this is it's the I'm friends with a celebrity metric. Essentially, it's a way of understanding the importance of a particular element based on who it's connected to. So not all relationships are the same. And essentially, you could only have two connections, but maybe those two connections are two organizations that are very influential based on who they're connected to. The simplest example would be if I had only one friend, but my friend was Taylor Swift, I would have a very high eigenvector score because Taylor Swift is very influential. So it changes how you define what influence means. Think of it in another context, like, maybe it's the advisor to the minister. So the advisor would probably have a higher eigenvector score because they have the ear of people that are very influential, something like that. The sort of visuals of what it produces looks something like this. So this is the same data set, and this is a basic kind of heat map approach. Basically, the red dots have the higher scores. And so what you can see when you look across each of these is that the dots that are red are in different positions generally. And that's because what is influential varies depending on what metric we're looking at, because it's answering a different question. So the degree metric is telling us who has the most connections. The closeness metric is telling us who is the most central element, who can get to every other element the fastest. Betweenness, there's actually only one dot that's there, and that's because it's the only dot that most often sits between two others. An eigenvector, and this is quite a common occurrence, you can see there's like a cluster of red dots together, and that's because it's kind of recursive. They're all feeding into each other's own influence. It's like a billionaires club or something like that sort of idea. They're all connected to each other, therefore they're all influential. So this is kind of answering different questions, and the great thing about this is it's the same data set. So we don't have to collect more information to answer each of these questions. It's the same information. It's just analyzed using different formula that, again, is based on graph theory. So when you're thinking about the sort of uses for that sort of information, some of the things include, point-in-time stock takes. What is the network doing? What does it look like? It can help you test assumptions about who to involve in processes. We think we should involve groups that, are really interested in emergency management. Maybe it's about involving groups that are really central to a community or to a context because of who they're connected to. But that group could be someone quite different to who you might assume. Looking at project planning or risk management, there's a very clear risk here if this organization is no longer operating. You can look at how results change over time longitudinally. So because they are quantitative, you could look at comparisons and seeing how things change due to different external factors like shifts in funding environments and how that influences collaborations, for instance. And you can obviously create the maps and feed them back into community engagement processes or partnership development. Use them as like a almost discussion generator. Here is what it looks like. What do you think? And just some of that shared sense making as well. And the key thing really is that it's one data point or one tool or process, and you can blend that with other data sources or data that you have available to answer other questions as well. So just quickly, how to do S&A, there's really just 3 core steps. The first one involves kind of this cyclical process a bit. So you do have to figure out the questions that you want to ask, and that will help you define some of those concepts. So we want to map out partnerships. Okay, what do we mean by partners? So you do kind of have to go back and forth through that process a little bit. You have to figure out what platform you want to use to do your S&A. So Kumu is the one that I prefer to use, but there are others. You can go to Google and just search S&A platforms, and there are several that will come up. Then you have to get into like the technical side. So what are the approaches for collecting data? As Jacinta mentioned at the start, we're using a survey-based approach, but I've done S&A maps in workshops. Like you're just asking people for information. You could ask it through interviews. You could ask it through a workshop-based setting. Like it doesn't have to be a survey. It's just that surveys kind of shortcut the data entry process a bit more and give people a bit more time to think about it too. You do have to then obviously go through, prioritizing the sorts of data that you want. You have to clean your data, you have to manage it, all those sorts of things. Very typical for any form of research process. The novel part is where you get to do the fun bit, which is the maps. Then you get to do your analysis. So you create your map first, and then you analyze the map, and then you can use the results of that analysis to feed back into your visualizations. So that's that heat maps that I showed you before. And then most importantly, disseminating it. So here are the results. Let's do something with it. that's all the process is. And I've kind of simplified and glossed over the detail of that. Step one, though, is the most important part, because once you've got the data, it's very hard to go back to people to get different information if you kind of didn't ask the right questions or if you didn't quite frame things in the right way. Okay, I'm conscious of time. So I'm just going to take you now into an example. So this was an S&A that I did in a local government context here in Victoria. So they wanted to use S&A for a very particular purpose. So it's a metropolitan council, and they wanted to know if they could use S&A to help inform their strategic planning processes in council. So the council has to develop a municipal emergency management plan. And they essentially were saying, well, we engage with particular types of organisations like the Country Fire Authority, Emergency Management Victoria, and those sorts of groups to inform that process. And within that process, they have to also do, sort of a degree of engagement with community organisations. But what they wanted to question is, could they use S&A to actually help make the processes that they use for strategic planning generally more effective? So could they use an S&A as like a whole of local government, this local government, or all of local governments, resource to inform strategic planning processes to decide who they engage for things like their community advisory groups? So the test case here was the emergency management strategic planning process, but that was kind of the vision. Could we test this idea, and then could we scale it across the council? So some of their assumptions were well, like I said, we engage emergency management organisations or groups with a focus on emergency management, but are they the right ones for the questions that we're trying to answer through our sort of community engagement arm of this process? They also wanted to just understand in general and it says health of relationships between organisations. This is because they were trying to pick up on the ideas of social capital in an emergency management context and looking at the relationship between organisations as well. So they wanted to kind of unpack if they could use S&A to help understand that. And just see what they could learn. So are there insights from this that we could consider as beneficial for the council in other ways? That second dot point feeds back into what I was saying about the longitudinal nature of it. So can they build up a longitudinal picture of who's out there in the community in terms of the community groups? Are there organisations that are pretty stable in who they work with or who they collaborate with? But are there organisations that, swing quite wildly between being very connected and very isolated or something like that? So there's a few ideas going around. And so they wanted to develop this process to pilot test this. And so, if it did work, could we actually do this, annually, for instance? So not every, 6 months, but once a year, could we refresh the map, build up a picture of shifts over time? And, there might be other things that emerge from that. So this is the product. So this is a static image of what it looks like. And so really all we did was we developed this tool, a survey-based tool that asked for the respondent organization's name, for the names of up to 5 other organizations that they worked with. And worked with is intentionally the phrase that we used. We didn't say partnered with or anything. We just said, worked with, however you understand that, because in this context, we were talking about community groups that could be like the sporting club. So, the cricket club, for instance, but also it included the land care group, for instance. So very different types of organizations. So we needed a phrase that could be a bit universal. They then went through and rated the strength of their partnership. So there was 4 statements that had a 6-point scale. So they ended up with a score between 4 and 24. So this is one of those overlays. And then another question that was an overall importance of the relationship question. It was a 5-point scale, but the numbers behind it were from 0 to 4. So that's another overlay. So the first 2 questions are giving us the 2 dots, the organization and who they work with, and then the line between them. The next one is then giving us 2 points of information that we can overlay on top of that, which on this map are the colors that you can see on the lines and the line thickness. And really what we were trying to highlight here is that there's the process side of a partnership, so the functioning of it, and then there's the purpose of the partnership. And we couldn't necessarily merge the two, because you could have a partnership that works really well, but overall, for the objectives that you have at that point in time, maybe it's not that important. like relatively speaking. Conversely, you could have a partnership that does not work well, like at all, but actually it's a really important partnership. Like they are two ideas that don't necessarily equal the same thing. And so we wanted to pick up on that idea. So we cleaned up the data, we uploaded it into Kumu. Here we've got line thickness for importance. So the thicker the line, the more important it is. So the closer to 4 it is, the thicker it is. So there's quite a few important relationships here. And then we used a heat map for strength. So basically, the more green it is, the higher functioning the partnership is. So you can see a few reds in there, but most of them are green, but there is some variance. You can also see there's some dots around the outside that have no connections. They are organisations that put in their name, but they didn't fill out any other questions. And we've kept those in because what we wanted to give the council was an understanding of who are the groups in your municipality. And, you know, if you repeated this then again the next year, you want to know that those groups are out there or were out there. Going back to what I was saying before, our 4 different questions that we can kind of answer. This is that same data set, and I've produced those 4 different metrics. This shows you just a bit of a high level view of the degree. So the number of connections, there's only a handful that are relatively large. The closeness scores, you know, there's a smattering of large ones. Betweenness, so that bridging role, there's kind of one key one in there. And then the eigenvector one, there's only a few as well. So again, quite interesting ideas of what we can produce. But one specific question, for instance, that you could look at here, the top 5 organisations that had the most connections identified by others. So this is basically someone else nominated them as a partner. There was only 5 organisations that had more than like 2 or 3, I think it was. They were 2 different types of not-for-profits, the library, a community house, and a community health service. And there's about 80 or 90 organisations on this map. So there's only 5 organisations that were nominated by a few other organisations as ones that they worked with. So this tells us, okay, well, there's actually 5 organisations here that are fairly visible across the network. And that's very, very useful for the council to know. Now, to wrap up, make sure we've got some time for some questions. The process that we're using here in the Snap is kind of similar to some extent. So we are asking for the same sorts of information. So we're asking to understand who your organisation is. We're looking to understand who you are connected to. And we've kind of set it up to 10 as a max. I mean, if you really want to provide more, you could fill out the survey a second time, by all means, but totally up to you. Then you've got questions around what the relationship looks like. So how does it come about? And then you've got questions around how it contributes to your work. The important thing that we want to recognize here is that relationships are complex within an organizational context. And so we're not looking to say, okay, you know, the CEO of each organization must be the one that responds. Like if multiple people from the same organization fill out the survey, that's fine. Basically, as a group, FPC will figure it out. Like, do not stress about that. Providing the information, and as Jacinta and Dan said, and providing those pictures of what's happening at different levels across country Queensland is the most important thing, and will ultimately produce a more richer, fuller picture of what the system looks like within the state. Oh, look, and I've written exactly that. So what we're trying to develop here really is quite, I think, not optimistic, but aspirational. We're trying to develop as full a picture of what the system in Queensland looks like, so that we can then understand the answers to some of these questions, so that we can then feed back those benefits to the wider group, the wider system, by understanding, you know, where are some of these, you know, pockets of really strong collaborations, but also where are people, you know, working together really closely, but they're actually quite isolated from everyone else, and are there opportunities to build relationships between others as well. We don't necessarily know what all of those questions are that we can answer, but as I've kind of tried to show you here, there are lots of questions we can answer once we have that information. And even just the visuals of being able to show, here's what the relationships across country Queensland look like, can be really powerful. So just to quick recap, SNA is a form of relational mapping. We're using it to develop visuals and analyze complex systems, typically of partnerships, but not necessarily. So it's providing a snapshot of a network. To do it, you need a purpose, like don't just do it because it takes time and effort. So make sure you've got a clear purpose and that this is the right method to fulfill that purpose. You need to be able to get the information. So you need the ability to do it, or to reach people to gather that information, I should say. And you need a kind of platform and the capabilities to develop the map. So like I said, it doesn't have to be a survey, it could be workshops or something else. It's only one method, so it does have limitations still. But this is where those clear planning processes and definitional processes and those sorts of things will make it as useful as it can be. And it is a really powerful process for developing that shared understanding of the bigger systems within which we're all working, particularly when we're thinking about partnerships. It's this idea of what is happening, and then ultimately interpreting what that means for the work that we're doing. Thank you. I will leave it there and hand back over to Jacinta.
Thank you so much, Matt. Absolutely love hearing you talk SNA, and I think every time I hear you do it, I pick up a whole bunch of new things that I didn't learn last time. So always really fantastic. We have had a couple of questions come on through in the chat. The first one being from Renee King. Now, Renee's actually had to duck out, but I did just want to raise the question in case others had the same one. You answered it a little bit earlier, but just to see if you'd like to add anything further. She asks, if we wanted to do SNA for our own networks, is there a software or system you would recommend we use to make the visual? She says, I've used Kumu before. Any others, which I know you touched on with Googling, but do you have any other particular insights or recs on that?
So probably so Kumu's a very good one in the sense that the user interface is fairly intuitive. The other one that I would suggest, which has maybe a bit of a steeper learning curve in terms of its interface, but it is open source and a locally installed program, which can sometimes be appealing to people. It's called Gephi, which is spelled Gephi. So that's what I actually originally started on, but I like Kumu because it is cloud-based and it allows you to do a bit more of that interactive stuff. The same company actually has another platform that is even simpler again to use called Sticky Studio. Sticky.studio is actually the web address if you type that into your URL. That's a good one if you just want to play around with even the idea of just mapping a system, but it's quite a rudimentary one. But Kumu is my sort of go-to just because it is quite easy to use, but Gephi is a free open source one as well, and is, like I said, a locally installed program. So that's always a good one.
Brilliant. All right, thank you. And so another question that we have is from Donna Ryan. She says, how do you distinguish the strength of the connection, or is this not important?
Yes, so there's two ways to think about that. So first, there's strength of connection in terms of effectively self-reported ideas. So in the example that I shared from Victoria, we basically had the functioning defined by 4 statements. And the 4 statements were centered around things that are fairly common in terms of like partnerships. So it was things like, we have, we work well together, we have shared priorities, things like that. And it was just a strongly disagree to strongly agree scale. It was only 6 points because we didn't allow fence sitting. And that was intentional. So you can have like self-reported processes of strength. So like, Dan rates me as like, yes, our relationship is very strong, whatever that means. Like you kind of have to go through those definitional things. The other part of it is not so much strength of the connection, but strength of the element's position in the network, which is what the network analysis metrics will tell you. So I won't say that it's objective because that's not quite true, but it's objective in the sense that based on the information that you have that constructs the visual, the metric will say, okay, Kara is most central in this network based on the information that's here. So I would boil it down to there's either like pure self-reports of strength, or there's kind of the more quant-based metrics as well. And the thing that kind of comes up that people will then say sometimes is like, oh, could we use like a partnership tool, for instance? Like the Vic Health tool is kind of always thrown about a lot. It's like 70 questions, and it's not actually about each relationship. It's more about the general functioning of the collaboration. It's a different type of tool. So this is where I always boil it back to, questions of purpose and questions of process, and then like just really good ones, but as few of them as possible. Because at the end of the day, it's like strength is kind of almost a subjective feeling, because oftentimes we're asking people to rank the strength of a relationship between two organizations, but it's actually between two people more often than not. And whilst Camilla and I might get along famously, let's say she leaves and someone else comes into her role at TQKP, and that person and I do not get along at all, like the relationship between FPC and TQKP could go down, but actually it's because the two people do not get along. So this is where that definitional stuff is really important, and like what it is that we're actually rating as strong or not is really, really key.
Yep, excellent. Excellent. And Donna has a further question, which is what if an organisation is based across multiple places and each place base has different connections?
Yes. So again, if in a sort of more general context, this is where if you were designing this process and implementing it, you'll just want to be really clear on, I call it like the level that we're operating at. So if you've got multiple sites, you might say, okay, well, we're going to do an SNA at the site level. And so I'll just use Smith family again as an example. You would write in that first field, like what is your organization's name? You would write like the Smith family hyphen Rockhampton, for instance. And then at a different Smith family site, you'd write the Smith family hyphen some other site. And then you can list all of those different connections. Because if you just write the Smith family, like you kind of don't have that understanding of place, which can be quite important, but also maybe it isn't, because you might be looking at a whole Smith family level. And so you might be saying, well, actually, we're not looking at place, localized place. We're looking at a much higher scale, hypothetically. It's just a definitional question. And so for the purposes of the SNAP, we are going for place specific. So to use that example there with the Smith family, Dan would be writing in the Smith family dash Rockhampton. And if there was another Smith family site in country Queensland, they would write the Smith family dash wherever that site is. They can list different connections. And then, as I said, it's up to FPC to basically clean all of that up and make sense of that. But it's two different organizations. And so that to me is like, well, that's two different dots. They're not the same dot. And so they should be separated.
Yeah. Absolutely. And I think, yeah, it's a really, really good question. And it's a really pertinent question with regards to the Country Collaborative Social Network Analysis Project as well, because what we do want to understand from undertaking this project are things like, is there a particular place-based site that happens to have all of these, say, broader advocacy connections who could then perhaps, support and work with another site, within their broader organisation, or also considering things like when it comes to a really large, say, government department, are there certain teams who do really connect well with different country communities, whereas others where, perhaps those ties are a little looser. So those are the types of things that we're hopeful of being able to answer via the SNA, which is a way of me leading into Leanne Bradley's question is, can you share what Thriving Queensland Kids Partnership has determined is the purpose and use for its SNA? And really it comes down to a lot of those types of questions, who connects us all together, who is connected to others who could perhaps provide that brokerage partnership role to others across the network. Are there any silences or gaps where it would actually be really important for there to be a stronger connection? By the definitional process that we've undertaken as a group, we're hopeful to be able to get down to a fair level of granularity, because of course the focus of the Country Collaborative is one of geography and one of place. So we want to sort of understand for people in those particular contexts, showing up to work each day in the Longreach office versus the Emerald office versus the Yeppoon office, how those connections all function. And that's, I hope, what our definitional process is going to elicit. But as Matt has expressed throughout today's session, the devil's most definitely in the detail there. Matt, did you have anything further to add to that point?
No, the most important part of it is like that it has to have a use or a purpose. Like they produce great visuals, but they are work. And you know, I wouldn't be suggesting for people just to do it because like having a purpose, even if it's exploratory, is like a very valid reason, particularly when you're looking at very sort of big scales geographically. So country Queensland, for instance, or in areas where there's, you know, just a very large number of relationships and moving parts organizationally. Like the map that I shared earlier that had sort of 1,000 organizations, like was a statewide project here in Victoria. So like it was all of Victoria, including Metro Melbourne, which is why there were so many organizations and groups involved.
Yeah, absolutely. Definitely like it's a broad technique with a lot of different applications. So folks, we're at a close for today. But before I let you all run away, just a couple of final things from me. The first one is I really hope all of you are on board to complete the social network analysis survey, which will be landing in your inboxes fairly shortly, emailed post-webinar. And as I mentioned, send it on to your networks, encourage them to send it on to their networks. Even if you don't want to participate in the survey yourself, you're still very welcome to forward it on to others who you think might like to contribute to the project. Get in touch with me if you'd like to learn more about the Social Network Analysis Project, talk about the Country Collaborative in further detail in our work, or any of the initiatives of the Thriving Queensland Kids Partnership. And finally, you'll see there that we do have an evaluation survey available. It would be great to hear your thoughts on what happened from your perspective today. So thank you all so much for coming. Hope to connect again with you soon in the very near future. And thanks also for all the work that each of you do each day for Queensland kids and further afield. Thanks.